Roguelikes has several traits that are pretty common among them. Permanent death, limited progression, high difficulty, randomization, and synergizing player abilities. It's those last 2 points that can make it difficult to understand the nuances of a game. To help with this, developers will often include useful info so that the player can understand how different items, weapons, abilities, power-ups, or whatever can affect things. Hades showing damage increases for boons, Slay the Spire card descriptions changing with player stats. All of these are ways to help players know how their character or build is progressing. Housemarque, on the other hand, must have been inspired by FromSoft. However, they weren't just satisfied with a confusing story. Returnal made sure to leave almost no part of their game mechanics fully explained. Vague descriptions, misleading descriptions, missing components of a description, no description at all. I'm surprised at how engaging and varied the developers managed to make their gameplay loop without the player fully understanding what exactly is happening. For context, I love Returnal. It's my favorite roguelike, which is a genre I already particularly like. I spent over 200 hours with the game and done pretty much everything there is as far as completionists go, including getting what I feel is a respectable spot on the tower leaderboard. Despite this, my process of making this video has led me to discover more about the specifics than I thought I would. My plan is to make several videos where I research and explain these mechanics. This first video I'll be looking at weapons, but I'll also make videos on enemies, items, and tower mechanics. All of these videos will be from the perspective of playing through the tower of Sisyphus. To briefly describe, the tower was a free update Housemarque added to Returnal almost a year after its initial release. It plays like an endless mode where players climb as high as they can while competing on the leaderboard for high scores. There are story elements added here as well, but the longevity comes from the endless climb itself. There's a lot to explore here, but weapons are at the core of a gameplay loop's variety, so understanding this seems like a good starting point. There are 10 guns plus a melee weapon in Returnal. Additionally, there are 11 alternate fires, which are like strong attacks that work on a cooldown. I'll cover all of these, but it's probably best to explain some universal mechanics before I jump into specific guns. Not including the melee weapon, a gun has 3 core stats associated with it. The first stat is always damage regardless of weapon, however the other 2 are unique depending on the weapon's type. For example, the modified Sidearm's 3 stats are damage, overload projectiles, and fire rate. Damage is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain what the other 2 unique stats do as I cover each weapon. Just know that any of these stats can range from a value of 0 to 15. Each weapon also gets assigned 1 of 11 alternate fires. Which one they get is random, and I won't list them out now as they'll be covered later on in the video. For now, just know that all alternate fires can have a level of 1, 2, or 3, with a higher level indicating a more powerful version. Finally, all weapons not including your melee have 9 traits that can appear on them. These are modifications that can enhance or change the mechanics of your gun. The traits are unique to each weapon, although there are a handful of similar or nearly identical ones between guns. Traits are split into 4 tiers, which I'll explain later. Each tier gets 2 traits with the exception of the first, which will get 3. With 10 weapons, that's 90 traits in total. Just like alternate fires, these traits are assigned a level of 1 to 3, which again indicate how effective the trait is. In order to use higher level alternate fires or weapon traits, they have to first be unlocked. While finding new weapons, you'll sometimes come across a locked trait or secondary fire. Unlocking these off the gun just requires that you defeat a certain number of enemies while holding the equipped weapon before the trait becomes usable. To get a level 1 trait, you'll need to kill 25 enemies, 50 to unlock a level 2 trait, or 100 to unlock a level 3. If you die or switch weapons partway through unlocking something, the progress is not lost. The next time you find a weapon that allows for that same trait or secondary fire to be unlocked, you'll be just as close to finishing it as you were before you lost the weapon. This also means that once you've unlocked or leveled up a trait, you'll never need to do so again. Some additional points that I'd like to make. First, secondary fires don't need to be unlocked, but they do need to be leveled up. This means that the first locked version of a secondary fire you'll encounter will be to just get the level 2 version of it. Second, weapon traits, unlike secondary fires, do nothing while leveling them up. If, for example, you're unlocking Adrenaline Discs 3, your gun won't even have access to the level 1 or 2 version of it. Alternate fires, however, have access to the previous level while unlocking the next. I assume Housemarque didn't want players to have moments when they couldn't use a secondary fire. Third is that having a higher level version of an alternate fire or trait unlocked doesn't guarantee that you're always going to get that. You can still come across a lower level version of the same trait or alternate fire at any time. It can't be overstated just how impactful alternate fires, and even more so, weapon traits are to a playthrough. If you want to make future runs easier, it's a good idea just to focus on unlocking new traits whenever you see one. If you keep ignoring traits, especially for guns you only recently unlocked, you'll never have a good version of that weapon show up during any of your playthroughs. With all that being said, we should also discuss proficiency and weapon levels. These are what determine your weapon stats, secondary fire level, and weapon trait levels. When playing through the tower, Celine will always start each run at proficiency level 0 and progressively increase as she kills enemies and picks up calibrators until she's at the max proficiency level of 45. What does proficiency level do? It determines the minimum level of new weapons you find, which also range from level 0 to 45. A weapon level can be slightly higher than your proficiency level, up to 2 levels higher I believe, but you'll never find a new weapon that has a lower level than your proficiency. So what does weapon level do? Quite a lot actually. The most straightforward thing that it does is determine your weapon's stats. Remember how I said that each stat can range from 0 to 15? With 3 stats to each weapon, this means that you can have stats go as high as 45 cumulatively. Every weapon level means that a point will be randomly allocated to one of its 3 stats, with no stat ever going above 15. There isn't any way to influence how these stats get allocated, and once you find a weapon, there isn't any way to increase its level further. Instead, you'll need to find new weapons as your proficiency increases. This does mean that being at the max level 45 would give you 15 in each stat. Aside from stats, weapon level also determines the maximum potential level of your traits in alternate fires. From level 0 through 9, you'll only ever find level 1 versions of these. From 10 through 19, you can find, but aren't guaranteed, level 2 traits in alternate fires. And then from level 20 onwards, you can find traits in alternate fires of any level. Finally, weapon level also determines how many traits you can have. While you can only have a single secondary fire, you can actually have up to 4 traits. This last part is a little bit more convoluted, but I'll be concise. Recall that traits are divided into 4 tiers. The weapon level determines how many of these tiers your weapon will pull from. From level 0 through 4, you'll get a trait from the first tier only. From 5 to 14, you'll get an additional trait from the second tier. 15 to 24, you'll find traits from the third tier added on. And from level 25 up, you'll get 4 traits, 1 from each tier. This means that traits from higher tiers will never appear unless you start leveling up your proficiency to find higher level weapons. This also means that every trait has at least one other trait that it will never be paired with. For example, you'll never find a sidearm that has both piercing and burst fire traits. You'll only get one or the other. Before diving into weapon specifics, I want to preface the rest of the video by saying that I made an effort to be as specific as I can when discussing what a weapon, trait, or secondary fire does. Despite this, I'll still be making some assumptions or generalizations on areas that my testing didn't fully cover. I couldn't achieve data dumps level of specificity in my testing, but I still think that what I had to say could be useful, or at the very least interesting to many players. I don't claim to be the first to have discovered anything that I discuss, but almost everything here is of my own findings. Some last notes: I'm not treating this as a tier list. I do have my favorite weapons, or weapons that I find to be more effective, but that's so heavily influenced by trait combinations and playstyles that I don't feel comfortable turning this into a tier list. Despite this, I'll still offer some impressions on traits that I found to be especially useful or otherwise. I just won't go as far as rating a weapon as a whole above or below any other, at least not now. Finally, the game's actually updated since I've been making this video. I don't think this will be a big deal, since they tend to just push bug fixes above all else. I just want to put this out as an FYI in case anything does change, although in my testing I didn't really find any differences between before or after the patch. Having gone all of that out of the way, we can finally start with our first weapon, the Atropian Blade. In Returnal, you can only carry a single weapon at a time. The exception to this is the Atropian Blade, which is always carried by Celine in addition to whichever gun you're currently holding. Looking at the limited actions you have with the blade, you can really only swing it on the ground or in the air one slash at a time. There's still a fair bit amount to know about it. If spammed, they come out at about 1 attack per second, which you're free to do as many times as you want on the ground, but only 1 time in the air before touching the ground. Each swing does 60 flat damage to enemies. Speaking of damage, I want to set the expectations that I won't be doing this in every case for every weapon. The blade is just especially easy to know how much damage it does, since it almost never changes. I wouldn't assume that Housemarque has finished updating their game, so getting hyper-specific on weapon damage will probably just shoot me in the foot, considering how difficult it is to do. Anyway, as I was saying, the blade does 60 damage. Sort of. There's actually a pretty large amount of enemies that will always die to one melee hit, regardless of how high their HP is. As you climb higher up the tower, enemy HP will also progressively go up. As long as you're using it against the right type of enemy, a melee hit will always be useful for dispatching them. Generally, it's the smaller type enemies and turrets that will die to one melee swing. The blade is also one of, if not the best weapon to stagger enemies with. With very few exceptions, a swing of your blade will always stagger an enemy. The length of the stagger varies between enemies, but they'll always be paused for at least a few moments before attacking you again. Be aware that you can't stunlock enemies in this way. Once staggered, the staggered bar will slowly go back down to empty. Until this is completed, no stagger damage can be inflicted on the enemy again. Staggering is particularly important for the blade since your melee does extra damage to staggered enemies. While the blade doesn't do any additional damage for hitting an enemy weak point, you will do triple the damage for hitting a staggered enemy. This comes out to 180 damage. Sort of. Actually, it's 180 damage for the first time you hit a staggered enemy, 120 for the second, and then back down to the base damage of 60 for every time after that. Once an enemy is re-staggered, you will go back up to doing 180 damage for the first melee hit, provided that they even live that long. The blade also breaks shields, which is how its importance in the campaign is first taught to you. This function is still important in the tower, and often the only way that you'll have to break shields. There's one last point about the blade that I'm pretty sure is a glitch, and I'm not talking about the DMJ movement tech. There's a quirk that when you use your melee attack in midair, then grapple to a ledge before hitting the ground, you'll be unable to do an aerial attack again until you jump and land. Even if you keep standing there doing grounded melees, the next time you leave the ground you will not be able to do a melee. This left me dashing towards enemies hoping to get a quick kill many times, only to fall to the ground without understanding what happened. If you do start recognizing this scenario, it's best to just jump after you grapple in order to refresh your melee. Again, I can't really see this as being intentional by the developers, so hopefully this will get fixed eventually. Modified Sidearm. Astra Pistol, for self-defense purposes only. Warning, unauthorized modifications detected. Not the most helpful description, but I imagine the developers knew that a pistol didn't need the most in-depth guide. I'm sure future descriptions will be much more helpful. The Modified Sidearm is a starting gun that you have in every run. It will always start at level 0, with no weapon traits attached to it. The only randomized part about it is what alternate fire you start with. None of this really matters since, by the second floor, the game will give you a new weapon, possibly an improved sidearm. As a gun, the Modified Sidearm fires bullets with high accuracy, range, and speed. You can either hold the trigger for automatic fire, or repeatedly press it, as it does function as a semi-automatic too. Besides the damage stat, the Modified Sidearm also has overload projectiles and fire rate. Since it's going to be relevant, now would be a good time to explain how ammo works. In Returnal, guns have infinite ammo and are limited only by how large the clip size is. As an example, the sidearm can fire 12 times before it needs to be reloaded. If you stop firing for a moment mid-clip, your ammo will start refilling on its own. If you use a clip to depletion, you can either wait until the weapon is reloaded automatically, or time Returnal's active reload system to instantly go back to full. They call this active reload system overload, which is mostly how I'll be referring to it going forward. Anyway, back to weapon stats. The overload projectile stat gives you extra bullets in your next clip after you successfully perform an overload. These extra bullets will be indicated by a little plus symbol next to your clip. For every point in the overload projectile stat, you'll get one extra bullet in your next clip after a successful overload. So with the stat maxed out at 15, you'll get 27 bullets every time you successfully overload. 12 for the base clip, plus 15 more for the overload. Fire rate is how fast the sidearm shoots when you hold down the trigger. Since the rate of fire can go as fast as you pull the trigger, low fire rate levels make it more worth focusing some attention on repeatedly pulling the trigger rather than relying on the automatic fire. Since higher levels of the stat actually make fire rate rather fast, it's a good alternative to having to repeatedly press the trigger. You can definitely still go faster if you press it really quickly, but I don't see how you could play well if you're overly focused on just shooting fast. Homing Missile. Fires homing missiles in addition to normal projectiles. A fair description. This causes an additional homing bullet to accompany every shot fired. Each homing shot does roughly 85% damage of the basic shot. Again, this adds a shot to your gun. It doesn't replace the original bullet. So getting a sidearm with Homing Missile 1 will almost double your damage output right off the bat. Higher levels of this stat will add additional homing shots per every time you fire, so 2 homing shots at level 2, or 3 at level 3. Since the homing shots are added every time you fire, you can see how having a high rate of fire would actually make this quite powerful. Ricochet. Projectiles will ricochet off surfaces and angle towards nearby targets. This trait allows shots to bounce off surfaces rather than come to a dead stop. Additionally, the bullet will attempt to angle towards an enemy after it bounces, making it easier to John Wick someone from behind cover. In my testing, it appears that higher levels just increase the potential angle that the bullet is willing to bounce in order to hit an enemy. Generally, it felt like I was getting better bounces at higher level versions of the trait. I can't say with 100% certainty, but it feels like this is all that higher level versions of the trait does. Snub-nosed Barrel. Deals more damage at the cost of accuracy. As it reads, this increases damage per shot but decreases accuracy slightly. You can still pretty reliably hit something from a fair distance, so I'd say this is still a good ability overall. Or at least, I would if it wasn't in this tier. As mentioned before, you can only have one trait per tier. The damage increase from Snubnose would have to be even more than Homing Missile to make up for its lower accuracy. When I tested it, a level 1 does roughly 7.5% more damage, while Snubnose Barrel 2 does around 15% more. Level 3 ended up being around 20 to 21% more damage than a base shot without this trait. Considering Homing Missile 3 more than triples your damage output, I can't see how Snubnose would ever be preferable, even as a level 3 trait. Piercing. Projectiles will pierce through hostiles and angle towards nearby targets. Like Ricochet, this is focused on adding aimed bounces to your sidearm. Also like Ricochet, I'm not actually completely solid on what the higher levels do, but I would guess it makes the pierced bullet more likely to hit another enemy. Pairing this trait with Ricochet will make it so you never have to face towards another enemy again. When using this trait, it's common to see your shots take down large groups of small enemies simultaneously, since each shot can travel through multiple hostiles. Note that piercing only applies to the base bullet. Homing missiles won't pierce, assuming it's paired with that trait. Burst Fire. Fires multiple projectiles in a single burst at the penalty of recoil. This is where I found the first instance of not having everything told to me, although it's an admittingly minor detail. Like it reads, you will now fire in bursts. The size of the burst starts at either 3, 4, or 5 bullets for levels 1, 2, or 3 traits respectively. The bullets don't change in damage value, so this is a good way to get more shots out, and the recoil is actually very manageable. Regardless of the trait level, you get 4 bursts per full clip. Since the size of the burst increases with the trait level, this actually means that your clip size will increase to have as many as 20 bullets if you use Burst Fire 3. This also changes how many bullets you get from overload projectiles. At max level, overload projectiles will actually give you 5 additional bursts if you have it paired with Burst Fire. So, pairing a sidearm with 15 in the overload projectile stats with the Burst Fire 3 trait will actually give you 45 bullets total, 20 from the original clip, plus 25 more from the overload. When you fire the bursts, there's a short pause between each round. Having a higher rate of fire stat will shorten this interval substantially. It does mean that you can't fire the sidearm as a semi-automatic anymore, but bullets come out so fast it's unlikely most people would match the rate of fire. Burst Fire synergizes pretty well with pretty much any other trait. It's especially noticeable when paired with Homing Missile. A sidearm with both Homing Missile 3 and Burst Fire 3 will fire off 15 homing shots for every burst. A small downside is that having a Burst Fire trait also slightly increases the reload time. This is definitely noticeable, but is somewhat mitigated by the fact that Overload Projectile now also gives you even more bullets, assuming you're using Burst Fire 2 or 3. Shrapnel. Projectiles may explode into multiple shards on impact. A true description, although explode could lead you to assume that this will deal more damage to the target it exploded on. Instead, it just makes bullets fly out with a chance to hit surrounding enemies. Unless this is paired with Ricochet or Piercing to allow the bullets to bounce back, don't expect any extra damage to the original target. In fact, don't expect much extra damage in any respect. The shrapnel shards explode out randomly, they don't intentionally angle towards anything. You will see some shards hit enemies that are grouped together, but it's a highly situational scenario where you're only getting marginal extra damage anyway. At the very least, the extra bullets look cool, although I'm not really sure what the higher tiers do. It's possible that it adds more bullets to the shrapnel explosion, or just makes the explosion more common, or both. Charging shot. Projectiles require charging, but are more powerful. True and true, although this trait's usefulness is highly dependent on what other traits you have it paired with. On its own, it increases bullet damage substantially, but at the cost of fire rate. Your shots come out so slowly that the increased damage is nowhere near enough to make up the difference. If you pair it with homing missiles, the additional charging doesn't even increase the damage of the homing missile itself. Instead, you just get fewer of them, with only the base shot doing more damage. Actually, having this trait seems to disregard your fire rate stat entirely. No matter how high your fire rate stat is, the charge time never seems to change. Where this ability shines, and where I think it's actually quite useful, is if it's paired with the burst fire trait. The time to charge doesn't change, even when it's fired in bursts, so you can fire a group of charged bullets all in a row. There is an unfortunate glitch though, at least I'm assuming it's a glitch, since it'd be odd for the developer to intentionally do this. If you pair this with burst fire 3, all the bullets after the first will do reduced damage. The second takes a significant nerf, but the third through fifth shots do less damage than it would if it wasn't charged at all. I can't really understand what's causing this, but it does mean you're probably better off pairing this trait with a level 2 or level 1 burst fire rather than a level 3. Pairing it with burst fire 2 does still seem to activate the reduced damage glitch, although at a much lower rate. If anyone can offer an explanation as to why this might be happening, please let me know. I'm willing to accept that there's a problem with how I was testing, rather than with the game itself. I do want to note that on screen I'm aware that I have the 75% weapon damage malfunction active. I don't think this is what's causing it. I've paused in the middle of firing to confirm that my damage is still normal. I've also moved as slowly as possible while this malfunction is active to confirm that it does indeed still give me full weapon damage. As long as I'm moving to some degree, it shouldn't be nerfing my damage, so I think it must be something else. Serrated projectiles. Projectiles cause additional damage over time. The level of this trait doesn't actually increase the damage of the dot. Instead, it seems to increase the total number of times you can stack this effect simultaneously. At a level 1 version of this trait, the damage over time seems to be able to be stacked up to 3 times. It seems to increase with higher levels, but it's really hard to see how many times it's stacking at the higher levels since the damage comes out so quickly. Regardless, a single stack of this will last for 10 damage ticks, with each tick doing about 25% damage of the base bullet. Since it's a percentage of your shot damage, this trait stacks very nicely with Snub-Nosed Barrel or Charge Shot, the latter dramatically increasing the dot effect. I don't think this makes Snub-Nosed Barrel preferable over Homing Missile, but it's still nice to keep in mind. Hit reload. Successful hits may instantly reload the weapon. The level of this trait determines how likely a hit is to trigger the instant reload effect. Incidentally, the target doesn't even have to be an enemy. You can hit a destructible object to trigger the reload too. Even homing missiles can trigger the reload effect, with your base shot never hitting an actual target. In fact, your alternate fire will even do the trick. With the right firearm, it becomes increasingly unlikely that you'll ever need to overload again. This sounds nice, but is actually of limited usefulness. Since overload projectiles was one of the 3 stats, you already had a weapon that could shoot many times before you even needed to reload anyway. Additionally, there are some artifacts that synergize nicely with overloading, and since you're very unlikely to ever overload, you'll never get these synergies. It's not too bad of a trait, but I think overall I would prefer serrated projectiles. One last note, the instant reload won't give you the extra bullets from overload projectiles, you'll only get the bullets from your base clip. Tachyomatic Carbine. Mechanical weapon, ballistic ammunition, high rate of fire. It's this game's version of a rifle. The basic rate of fire is quite fast, and its shots have speed and accuracy, just like the sidearm. The damage per bullet is lower than that of the sidearm, but the rate of fire is much faster. Besides damage, the 2 unique stats for the carbine are overheat limit and projectile speed. Both of these are very straightforward. Overheat limit increases your clip size, while projectile speed increases the speed of your shots. Armor piercing. Projectiles will pierce hostiles and ricochet off surfaces. This is like taking half of the sidearm's ricochet trait and half of its piercing trait. You don't get any shot angling towards nearby opponents, but you do get the piercing and bouncing effects instead. I'd say the piercing is the more useful piece of this. It's easier to line up shots when the opportunity to hit multiple enemies allows, but I find bouncing shots off surfaces without any bullet assistance is just mostly relying on luck. This is another example where I don't really know what the higher levels of the trait does. It doesn't appear to affect damage, so I guess it's affecting how many bounces you get instead. Critical hit. Projectiles may deal additional damage. Right, you can score a crit. At level 1, this happens about 7.5% of the time, although I admit my test sample wasn't nearly large enough to get a definitive answer. The odds of getting a crit increase with a higher trait level. At level 1, your bullets will also do double damage whenever the crit procs. Along with the proc rate, the increase to the damage also seems to go up with higher level versions of this trait. Even still, the increase to damage really isn't all that much, since almost all your bullets are still going to be regular even with the highest version of this trait. Still, damage is damage, so this isn't a terrible trait to have. Hardened. Increases protection. Yeah, that's it. I didn't mention this before, but Celine has her own stats separate from her weapon. Two big ones are weapon damage and protection. I'll cover this now since weapon damage is going to come into play later in this video. Weapon damage is separate from the weapon's bonus damage stat, but effectively it does the same thing. Usually. There are multiple ways to increase this, but since it's tracked separately from your gun stats, I don't really need to go into detail on it. Protection increases your defense, resulting in less damage being taken. The Harden trait just gives a flat increase to the stat. Harden level 1, 2, and 3 give 10, 15, and 20% bonus protection respectively. There isn't really much else to say here, but it is a very useful increase, and I do find the visual indicator for the weapon trait to be pretty cool. High caliber. Higher damage at the expense of fire rate. The tier 2 carbine traits both change how your weapon behaves. For the high caliber trait, it's a pretty substantial damage increase with larger bullets. The lower fire rate isn't too bad of a trade-off considering how much more damage this adds. At higher levels, the penalty to rate of fire is somewhat mitigated while the damage per shot is increased. What I mean to say is, a level 3 high caliber trait actually fires faster than a level 1. Rising pitch. Fires faster the longer the trigger is held. This trait won't change the damage per shot of the base gun. Instead, it changes the rate of fire to build up to a much faster frequency. When you first start shooting, it's actually a slower rate of fire than the base version of the gun, but it quickly builds to max speed, which is noticeably faster. Higher levels of this trait increase the rate of fire and I believe the damage per shot. Since you'll have to have either high caliber or rising pitch, the gun's damage is heavily influenced by what level the trait is. Both traits increase fire rate and damage, so not having the highest level possible for your weapon level will substantially lower your damage output. Payload rounds. Killed hostiles drop clusters of miniature bombs upon death. Payload rounds have mastered the art of subtlety and stealth. Your enemies will never see it coming, because it will never hit them. Even at max level, the bombs are so small and unassuming that I could forgive you mistaking them for dropped obolites instead. The explosions are tiny and hardly have audio, and the blast radius is so small that it'll only hit enemies that are pretty much directly on top of it. The rounds will bounce a couple times in an attempt to encourage each other before giving up and disappearing. If you manage to actually see it happen, the damage of these bombs is actually not terrible, but honestly, even if it was guaranteed to kill any enemy caught in this monumental blast, I still wouldn't really want this trait over its alternative in the same tier. I had to wait for enemies to be practically climbing on top of each other just to get footage of the payload rounds actually hitting something. Best I could say for this is that it doesn't actually actively make your weapon any worse. Leech rounds. Successful hits may repair your integrity. Integrity is this game's word for health. At higher levels, the proc rate seems to go up, and the healing rate may also be going up. I do know that the amount you heal at least scales with how much damage you're doing. So pairing this with high caliber or rising pitch will still both give you good healing. One will just heal you more often for less, while high caliber will heal you less often but for much more. Even though the healing is marginal, I would still much rather have this than payload rounds, which is practically useless. Hyper accurate. Accuracy and recoil are greatly improved. Yeah. I'll be honest, I didn't really have a problem with either of those properties. I don't find the recoil on the carbine to be all that high, and shot spread on the carbine is low enough that it already stands as one of the most accurate weapons. I'm assuming higher levels of this trait make the change more pronounced, but it's hard to care when this really wasn't a problem to begin with. Accelerated. Kills decrease dash cooldown and increase fire rate. That's more like it. Higher fire rate really just means more damage, and the increased rate is noticeable too. Pair high level accelerated with high level rising pitch and the bullets will come out almost comically fast. Additionally, the cooldown on your dodge becomes very low. Low enough that you could probably reliably dodge some pretty intense bullet hills. At max level, the effect lasts 10 seconds. I'm not sure if this is the same at lower levels. Spitmaw Blaster. Bioengineered weapon, bioammunition, very effective at close range. It's a shotgun. A very cool one. It's also one of 2 guns that can never have its clip size increased. You always get 6 shots, no matter what level the weapon's at or which traits you have. As expected, the damage at close range is very high. At further distances, the damage per pellet starts to drop off significantly, not to mention the spread of your pellets makes it so fewer shots are likely to hit a single target. In fact, this is the only weapon that decreases in damage with range. Focusing your aim can help with this, as it reduces the spread of your shots. Unlike the first 2 guns, you're not able to hold down the trigger. You have to keep pressing it if you want shots to continue to fire. For its unique stats, we have effective range and stagger power. Effective range reduces the amount of damage drop-off when farther away from your target. High levels of this trait allow you to be reasonably effective, even from medium range. Stagger power increases how much stagger damage you do to enemies with the Spitmaw. This doesn't increase damage to staggered enemies, just how quickly the stagger bar builds up. Wide Maw. Projectiles deal additional damage, but have a wider spread. The damage increase is no joke. Even at level 1, you're doing 40% more damage at point blank than you would be at the base fire, which further increases with higher levels of this trait. The damage drop off at higher ranges is also very severe though. If your Spitmaw has a Wide Maw trait and has low effective range stat, you'll want to stay close to enemies in order to keep the damage consistently high. Effective range stats can really help you so you're at least able to stay at medium range without needing to be at point blank range. It's also good to remember that you're able to focus your fire if you hold down the left trigger. This will allow your shots to have a tighter spread and hit enemies more easily. Narrow Maw. Projectiles have a tighter spread. This trait's pretty good for maintaining larger distances from enemies. Even a low level weapon with this trait, with a low effective range stat, can still reliably kill enemies without being right up to them. A point blank shot isn't any stronger than the base version of the Spitmaw, at least not with the level 1 version of this trait. The benefit instead comes from the more narrow shot spread. Once this trait is maxed out, the spread is actually really narrow, allowing you to be a fair distance away from the enemy. Slug Shot. Fires an additional high damage, high speed slug shot. This is the only way to keep the Spitmaw Blaster's original spread. Rather than change the trajectory of your pellets, a single slug will be added every time you fire a round. The slug travels down the center of your sight and doesn't suffer from decreased damage at farther ranges. The slug is decently strong, meaning shooting enemies from across the room and only hitting with the slug will still do some damage. At higher levels of this trait, the damage of the slug will increase. Explosive Spit. Projectiles explode on impact, or after a set distance. The explosion isn't too pronounced. Pellets explode in a greenish cloud which adds damage to the attack, and presumably some splash, although testing might suggest otherwise. I don't really have much else to say about this ability. I believe the damage from the explosion will still scale down with distance, based on my time with the trait. Rapid Spitter. Fires at full auto mode. At level 1, the rate of fire isn't any noticeably faster than if you were just manually pressing the trigger. You can empty a full clip in about the same speed of 2.5 seconds, but it's still nice not to have to focus on pulling the trigger. Higher levels are where the usefulness of this trait becomes obvious. Level 2 allows you to empty the clip in about half the time, while level 3 takes 1/3 of the original time, coming in just under a second. Having a machine gun style shotgun makes the damage potential skyrocket. The biggest downside is the Spitmaw's small clip size, meaning you'll have to be reloading almost as often as you're firing when using high level versions of this trait. If only there was a way to reduce the number of times you have to reload. Backsplash. High chance to regain a projectile if all pellets hit a target. They order these abilities almost as if to immediately address the ammo concern. Being in Tier 3, you can pair this ability with Rapid Spitter to greatly increase how long you're able to fire. Even with the level 1 trait, the odds of regaining a shot are pretty high. At level 3, it seems practically guaranteed that you'll get your shot back as long as all your pellets hit. Although, needing to have all the pellets hit is the biggest drawback. You're not going to see this activate very often against small or distant targets, especially if you have this paired with Widemaw. The most consistent application of this trait is against Algus, making it so you'll almost never have to reload for the entire fight. Critical Stagger. Projectiles deal additional damage to staggered hostiles. Honestly, I don't know what this trait does. I assume it does what it says in the description, but I couldn't get any concrete damage increase on any staggered enemy. I tested against this Frost Severed for a good 10 minutes and could never once notice any increase in damage. It doesn't help that I was using Widemaw against the skinny bastard, but I was assuming that I would at least see some shots do noticeably more damage. The footage here is for the level 2 version of this trait too, so it shouldn't be too hard to spot. I can see plenty of times that I'm shooting them when their stagger bar is still blinking, meaning that they should still be in the staggered state. Unfortunately, the easiest enemies to hit consistently, the Flying Machina enemies or Algos, don't get staggered. Algos doesn't show any damage values anyway, so testing them would have been doubly useless. Other enemies either fly too high to be a reliable test, or tend to die in a single shot at point blank regardless. Because of this, I don't even know what the higher levels of the trait do. It could increase the proc rate, or the damage increase you get, but it's hard to tell. It's a bit frustrating because this would actually pair very nicely with the shotgun. Not only does it easily stagger enemies itself, you're also likely to be in melee range when you're using the Spitmaw, which again, is pretty much a guaranteed stagger if you hit them with the blade. Ah well, I assume it does work as described, just not in any way that I can verify in my testing. Piercing Spit. Projectiles will pierce through enemies and explode on delay. I promise, not every gun has the potential to pierce enemies. I guess Housemarque just liked the effect for these first few weapons. This is my favorite version of a piercing trait. It doesn't seek out new enemies after a pierce, like the Sidearm's version does, but the explosion makes this very satisfying to use. The sound alone makes me want to have this trait on at all times. I don't know what higher levels of this trait does. I imagine it makes explosion damage more significant, but I'm not sure. Regardless, the damage is noticeable and can help finish off enemies if your initial shot doesn't. Acid Clouds. Hostiles leave acid clouds behind upon death. To me, this feels like another non-trait, like the Carbine's payload rounds. I don't really want to rehash my rant, but I don't like these traits that do small range damage effects at or near the point of enemy death. The enemy most likely to be caught in the damage zone is the one you just finished killing. These types of traits could be cool if the effect was greatly increased so that I could actually catch some enemies. Pyroshell Caster, mechanical weapon, fires arcing projectiles that attach to hostiles and explode with a slight delay. For being a grenade launcher, I wouldn't have expected this to be the gun with the highest homing capabilities in the game. That won't be relevant until we get to the traits though, so more on that later. In addition to sticking to enemies, you can also attach the grenades to surfaces. The Pyroshell has a good blast radius, so it's often easier to hit enemies this way rather than sticking to them directly. Despite what I said about homing just now, the base shot doesn't actually have any homing capabilities. The gun is fully automatic, although the rate of fire isn't anything earth-shattering. Each shot travels in a slight arc, meaning distant targets will need to be adjusted for some drop-off. The weapon stats, besides damage, are explosion radius and explosion delay. Both are pretty self-explanatory. The explosion radius already starts off pretty big at base level, and gets surprisingly huge at the max level. As for explosion delay, I don't really find the stat all that meaningful. It definitely does reduce the delay of the explosion, but it was never so slow that it made much of a difference. Streamlined chamber, increased fire rate. They really didn't mess around with this description. It's hard not to like fire rate increases on weapons. While not as extreme as Rapid Spitter, the difference in speed between a level 3 trait and not having it at all is still very noticeable. Just like with Spitmaw, more shots means more damage. Out of the 3 Tier 1 traits, this one will synergize best with those of later tiers. Secondary Explosion. Projectiles explode twice. A straightforward and useful ability. The power of the second explosion is determined by the level of the trait. At level 1, the second explosion will do 1/3 the damage of the original. This increases to 2/3 at level 2, and at level 3, the explosion matches the first, effectively doubling your damage. Bouncy Projectiles. Projectiles bounce before exploding. Okay, this description is up there for the most incomplete, but it does have some competition coming up for later weapons, so look forward to that. Saying they bounce before exploding isn't wrong, but it's more accurate to say they bounce before sticking. I know, a minor difference, but the description makes me think that it will explode in midair after bouncing, or that it can bounce off enemies. In truth, the explosion timer doesn't start until it sticks, and it won't bounce off enemies or destructible objects. The bigger problem with the description is what it's leaving out. After the shot bounces, a homing shot will come out from the point of the bounce. If enemies are nearby, this shot will seek them out and deal damage. At higher levels, not only does the number of bounces increase, but so do the number of homing shots. A level 3 trait will result in up to 3 bounces, each of which will produce 3 homing shots. So going from a level 1 trait to a level 3 trait will increase the number of homing shots from 1 to 9, provided you get all the bounces. As nice as all this sounds, and it is nice, there are a couple problems with this trait. First, the Pyroshell already has a very good blast radius. While the bounce does allow for more chances to stick to enemies, usually I'd rather it stay where it is. With this enormous blast radius, slightly missing an enemy will still likely result in them getting caught in the explosion. The bounce does have a homing shot, which helps, but I find watching the grenade sail away from where I originally aimed it a bit disheartening. Second problem with the bounce is that after the first phase, the tower has a more modern open design. This increases the likelihood that your shots will just fly away into the sunset with only a few homing shots to show for it. Despite all this, I still like the trait. It can be powerful and pretty fun if used correctly. Sticky bonus. Attached projectiles deal more damage upon exploding. That sums it up. Question is, how much more damage? Well, at level 2, it's about a 50% increase. I had some trouble verifying the other levels, but I'll assume it goes up or down depending on if you have a level 1 or 3 trait. I know, not a lot to say here, but it's more damage if you get the direct hit, which is nice. Seeking flares. Primary explosions generate homing flares that seek out additional targets. I'm stunned. This description has some nuance to answer more detailed questions. The primary explosion sends out homing flares. I tested and verified, you won't get another set of flares if you pair it up with secondary explosion. Still, the seeking flares are, frankly, amazing. You're not required to kill an enemy, or even hit them, which is probably the biggest advantage of this trait. Any surface your shot explodes on will create the flares. You'll get 3 flares per explosion per level, so if you get up to a level 3 trait, you'll get 9 flares per explosion. The flares also have a wide range of what they will home for. While the shot produced from bouncy projectiles won't really home unless something's really close by, seeking flares don't have that problem. They'll make sharp turns to hit enemies quite a distance away. With this trait, it can be easier sometimes to just fire your shots at the ground or at nearby surfaces and let the flares do the work. Another really nice bonus, these flares will even target the enemies they were originally attached to, doubling in on themselves for more damage. Enlarged chamber. Overheat limit increased. This just increases the clip size. Where you normally have 6 shots per clip on the Pyroshell, each level of this will increase it by an additional 2 shots. This means that at level 3, you'll have double the clip size, with a total of 12 shots per clip. The Pyroshell has one of the slower reload speeds in the game, so being able to avoid having to reload as often due to having a larger clip is nice. Anti-gravity projectiles. Projectiles defy gravity, traveling farther and faster. The arc of your shot will be less steep, resulting in a smaller drop-off at greater distances. At level 3, the shots will just go in a straight line without ever starting to fall. This can help with picking off enemies, especially aerial ones, as you no longer have to factor in the arc in the trajectory. Not the most glamorous trait, but it has its uses. Auxiliary projectiles. Auxiliary projectiles are fired alongside the main projectile. This isn't too dissimilar from the Sidearm's homing missile trait. The auxiliary projectiles here will come out with each shot fired and home in on targets. The homing on this one is pretty pronounced, with shots sometimes taking an immediate drastic turn in order to hit something outside of your line of sight. The damage output is high too, especially at higher levels. If paired with seeking flares, the need to make direct hits will be increasingly unnecessary. Add in bouncy projectiles if you want to see how many homing shots can be on screen at once. Simmering explosion. Projectiles deal damage to nearby hostiles before and after exploding. It's a fun trait to use. Its visual effect makes the air around the shot appear superheated, making a damaging haze wherever the shot lands. The damage itself is pretty high, and can easily deal with smaller enemies without the shots ever needing to explode. At max level, the size of the haze increases substantially. Pair this with Streamlined Chamber, and you'll no longer be able to see the poor souls on the other end of the haze, just their shrinking health bars. Coilspine Shredder. Bioengineered weapon. Fires spiky discs that bounce off surfaces. charge weapon to deal more damage. Railgun, high accuracy, high damage, low rate of fire, railgun. Even when completely uncharged, the damage is among the highest for a single bullet in the game. The more you do charge it, the more the damage will increase. At full charge, you'll be dealing double damage compared to an uncharged shot. A full charge only takes half a second, so it can be worth taking the time for the extra damage. The description mentioned a bounce, but at this point, it probably isn't surprising to hear me say that the projectile bounce isn't really all that useful. It doesn't angle towards targets, so you're just hoping the bounce will somehow find another target on its own. The shot also pierces targets, which is more useful than the bounce at least. For stats, we get reload speed and charge mobility. Reload speed increases reload speed. At max level, you'll see a large improvement versus a low level Coilspine. This is an important stat, as a Coilspine only gets one shot per round, so you'll want to minimize how long you need to wait for the next shot to be ready. Charge mobility is how fast Celine will walk when charging her shot. While you can never sprint while charging, a max level stat will at least allow you to maintain your jog speed, versus a low level trait reducing Celine to a walk. The highest level makes it much easier to step out of the way of attacks while keeping your shot ready to fire. Alt-fire cooling. Successful hits reduce alt-fire cooldown. No false advertising here. I'll cover alt-fires in more detail later, but remember earlier in the video that I said alt-fires all operate on a cooldown. If your alt-fire is currently recharging, you can speed it up by hitting enemies with the Coilspine. At first, I thought the cooldown reduction was a flat 1 second per trait level, a mistake I made due to how many alt-fires have a cooldown of 20 seconds. In truth, it appears the cooldown is actually percentage based. You'll get 5% reduction per hit, per level of this trait. So at level 3, you'll have a 15% reduction to your cooldown every time you hit an enemy with a Coilspine. For the alt-fires that have a 20-second cooldown, this means that it's 1 second per hit. However, longer cooldowns like the Voidbeam or Doombringer will have more shaving off their total time. The effect procs per hit, so if the beam pierces enemies or bounces between them, you'll get more cooldown reduction. Shooting a destructible object also procs the effect. This is the single fastest way to reduce alt-fire cooldown in the game, especially as a level 3 trait. Shattering discs. Projectiles explode after reaching max targets, / bounces. And we were doing so well with the description accuracy too, we had several good ones in a row. I feel the way this one was written is just straight up incorrect. While your shots do explode, it isn't after reaching a certain number of targets. Instead, it releases an explosion every time it hits a target. If your shot hits more than one enemy, then you'll see more than one explosion. I don't know if this is intentional, as it seems odd that a projectile will continue to exist after it supposedly exploded. Still, this makes the trait better than what the description suggests. When shooting on surfaces, the explosion actually behaves as advertised, and only explodes after it's done bouncing. At first, I didn't think I would find this trait to be too useful. This is largely because of the bad description, but also because the damage it adds was much higher than I thought it would be. The level 1 trait's explosion deals half the damage of the shot itself, and since it will always explode on enemies, you can think of this trait as a flat damage increase with a small AoE effect to boot. At level 3, the explosion does the same damage as the shot itself, resulting in double damage. As a very nice bonus, the explosion damage scales with your charge. So, a fully charged shot with level 3 shattering discs will do 4 times the damage of an uncharged, non-exploding shot. Adrenaline discs. Each hit has a chance of awarding extra adrenaline. I haven't even mentioned adrenaline in this video. I won't go into detail here, but know that there are plenty of reasons to increase your adrenaline, like easier reloading, a shield to take a free hit, or spidey senses. You get 1 adrenaline for every 3 kills, with a maximum of 5 adrenaline. This means that you need 15 kills to go from 0 to max adrenaline. Whenever your adrenaline isn't maxed out, you're going to want to get it back up there as soon as possible. This is mostly because of the free shield you get when you're at max adrenaline. Back to the adrenaline discs trait, being able to get additional adrenaline for simply hitting a target can be immensely useful. When it does proc, you get the same amount of adrenaline that you would for killing an enemy. The difference here being that you don't have to kill the enemy, you only have to hit them to have a chance of the increase. Something you don't want to overlook is that this procs on destructible objects, just like alt-fire cooling does. By the time you get to phase 3 of the tower or higher, there'll be plenty of eggs or stashes to shoot as a safe way to build up your adrenaline. Keep in mind that these destructible objects also appear in rooms without any enemies. Make sure to shoot these if you're in one of these rooms without max adrenaline. Higher levels of the trait noticeably increase the proc rate, though I don't know the exact percentages. Enlarged Chamber. Overheat limit increased. Yes, it's exactly the same trait description as seen on the Pyroshell Caster. This time, you only get 1 extra shot per level. This makes it a more pronounced change, since the gun normally only gets 1 shot. This means that at trait level 3, your clip size will be quadrupled versus the Coilspine without this trait at all. This is one of a couple Coilspine traits that encourages you not to charge your shots. If you're trying to line up a shot, or waiting behind cover, then by all means, charge up, but your damage will be higher overall if you just quickly fire off all your rounds. The double damage from a full charge isn't enough to make up for how quickly you can fire off all the uncharged shots, especially from a level 3 trait. Twin Discs. Fires a smaller projectile alongside the main projectile. Alongside actually means directly behind. It can be hard to even see the second shot due to the first shot's tail. Since the twin disc follows the same trajectory as the first, and since both discs move so fast, it's likely that you'll just hit the target with both. The description calling the projectile smaller implies that it should be weaker. This is only really true at trait level 1, where the extra disc will do half the damage of the first. At level 2, it'll do the same amount of damage as the first shot, and at level 3, it'll do 1.5 times more. This is an even bigger potential damage increase than shattering discs. Both the twin and the original disc will benefit from charging, meaning you don't have to feel compelled to just fire it off quickly, especially since you can't have this trait paired with Enlarged Chamber. Also, in case you're wondering, the second disc won't proc alt-fire cooling. I'm assuming this means that it also can't proc adrenaline discs, though I didn't verify that. Something that I only noticed happening after a long time using it is that the twin disc can apparently home. I believe this only happens if you had the enemy in sights at the time you release the trigger. If the enemy moves out of the way during the travel time, which is unlikely, the second disc will curve to catch them. This is certainly nice for hitting moving targets, although you'll rarely notice it. Your aim has to be pretty good for the homie to take over, at which point the enemy's probably going to get hit anyway. Retarget. Projectiles seek out additional hostiles upon hitting the initial target. This functions a lot like the Sidearm's piercing ability. The Coilspine already pierces its targets in its base version. Add the angle-seeking behavior, and it's pretty much in line with the piercing from the Sidearm. Just like the piercing trait, you need to hit an enemy to trigger the homing bounce. Hitting a wall or floor will just result in a normal, non-homing bounce. When you do hit an enemy, you can expect to see surrounding weaker enemies suddenly disappear. Like piercing from the Sidearm, I'm not sure what the higher level versions of this trait does. I would have the same guess that it just makes the bounces more accurate. Splitting discs. Direct hits split the projectile into 2 additional projectiles. The Coilspine has thus far been blessed with consistently useful traits, but this is the first one that I'm never happy to see. When hitting an object, your shot spawns 2 additional shots that go at about a 45-degree angle from the first. I say spawn because once again, the description lies. It doesn't split, as the original shot will still continue on alongside the 2 it creates. Because the new shots don't home, and because they come off at an angle from the original impact, it's hard to purposely hit another enemy with the new shots. I don't know what the higher levels of this trait does. Maybe it makes the split do more damage, but I so rarely will hit an enemy that it doesn't really matter. Enhanced Charge. Charged projectiles are even more powerful. This is probably the most inaccurate trait description in the game. It's actually completely wrong. This doesn't make your charged shots any stronger. In fact, you'll be less likely to want to charge your shots at all if you ever come across this trait. This isn't to say that the trait is bad, it's actually very good. Instead of increasing the power of your charged shots, it just increases the power of your shots. Period. I guess this does technically improve the power of the charged shot, since a full charge will still deal double damage. The difference that I'm trying to make clear is that whether you charge your shot or not, you'll still get the power increase from this trait. At level 1, the power increases 20%. Level 3 brings us all the way up to 60%. Fortunately, if paired with twin discs, this also increases the power of the second disc. I assume this also increases the power from the explosion of shattering discs, though I didn't verify that combination. Even after all that, a more accurate name for this trait would be Nerfed Charge. While the 2x multiplier for a full charge remains constant, the amount of time it takes to get to a full charge increases with each level of this trait. At level 1, it takes a full second to complete a charge, doubling from the original half second. At level 3, the time will triple the original, coming in at a full second and a half. Now that it takes so long to get to full charge, you're better off releasing the shot immediately. This mismatch between the trait description and how it actually functions leads me to believe that this is another example of something not working as the developer intended. Negating Discs. Fired projectiles destroy hostile projectiles. A very cool ability to end this weapon on. To make up for the Coilspine's narrow line of fire, the negation affects a generous area around the shot too. I believe, but didn't confirm, that higher level shots increase the area of negation. Regardless of the level, it will affect all round and bullet type enemy projectiles, although it doesn't stop the ring style attacks. It surprisingly does destroy beam attacks. Completely useless knowledge, as the beam will just reappear after the few frames it takes for your shot to pass through. Against Algus, this makes it so that you don't even have to try to dodge some of his attacks. Just shoot and watch their offense fall apart. Thermogenic Launcher, mechanical weapon, fires homing rockets that explode with slight delay or when hitting targets. A rocket launcher with a unique homing mechanic. Unique in that it will home for a point in the distance, miles away, far off screen, in a straight trajectory. I can be lining up my shots to just barely miss the target and watch as my rockets sail past without a care in the world. Even if you accurately aim and the enemy moves out of the way, it'll still just continue in a straight line. Now's a good time to mention that I don't use aim assist. If you do play with it, or watch others who do, you'll see that your shots will correct for any slight inaccuracies. This can make it appear that shots, like those from the Thermogenic Launcher, actually have some homing capabilities. I don't count this, as it's a universal setting that just changes the initial trajectory of the shot. It doesn't actually add any homing. Regardless, homing or no, this is still a powerful weapon to come across. When firing, the shots will come out in a salvo of 3 rockets. You get 3 salvos per clip, meaning you can fire 9 rockets before reloading. For stats, you get explosion radius and reload speed. Not much more I can offer here. As you level up explosion radius, the size of the blast becomes noticeably larger. Reload speed takes a launcher from being at the slower end, up to a decent rate at maximum stats. Easy to use. Kills reward extra proficiency. I didn't really go through and test how effective this trait is. It would have been hard to do, and I'm honestly not really all that interested. It's likely that higher levels of the trait make it so that kills give even more proficiency. This is useful for finding higher level weapons earlier, but ultimately doesn't matter as you'll reach max level pretty early into a run. The description says it only works on kills, so this won't impact Celine's proficiency stat, as it won't work on calibrators. Annoying as that would have been an easy way to know exactly how much each level increases it by, but still, it doesn't really matter. Obolite Magnet. Chance to automatically gather obolites from killed hostiles. Normally, you won't be able to collect the game's currency unless you're close to where it drops, which is usually where the enemy dies. Obolites disappear pretty quickly, so killing an enemy from across an arena probably means you won't be getting any money for it. Obolite Magnet gives a chance for the money to just vacuum into Celine from anywhere within the arena. This can actually substantially increase your money if you haven't been diligent about running up to where they die, or if you haven't been leaving floors quickly after dispatching enemies, as this awards bonus obolites. As will be clear in later weapons, I don't really care for these types of traits. Obolites is almost never a limiting factor for me. Higher levels will probably increase a proc chance of the obolites being sucked into you, but again, I don't really care. Critical rockets. Projectiles may explode twice. This is a pretty underwhelming ability, as the effect is dismal. Regardless of the trait level, the second explosion does half the damage of a direct hit with a rocket. This would have been great if the second explosion would have procced with any amount of consistency. Testing this with a level 3 trait resulted in the second explosion about 15% of the time. Assuming that number is accurate, this means that you'll only get a 7.5% damage increase with the highest level trait. Even still, you're likely to prefer this ability over the other tier 1 options, as easy to use becomes obsolete after a while, and Obolite Magnet loses a lot of utility after you start maxing out stats and finding all the artifacts you want. As pitiful as it is, extra damage is extra damage. Enlarged Chamber. Overheat limit increased. A popular ability. It functions like it does with the Pyroshell and Coilspine, in that it gives you more shots before you need a reload. You get 3, 6, or 9 extra rockets for levels 1, 2, and 3 respectively. The weapon does reload slowly, so this is certainly a nice trait to have. Replicating hits. Successful hits shoot off extra homing rockets. Okay, forget what I said about Enlarged Chamber, it doesn't really hold a candle to this trait. The word homing used in the description is a more conventional kind, in that it actually seeks out targets. To get the extra rocket, you need to hit an enemy directly with your shot. You can't just catch them in the blast radius. The trait level indicates how many cycles the rocket will replicate itself for. Regardless of the trait level, hitting an enemy directly will only result in 1 replicating rocket. If you have higher trait levels, the new rocket will then replicate again once it hits another target. Higher trait levels also look to increase the damage of the replicating rocket, though I wasn't able to get anything solid in testing. If there are any destructible objects around, you can shoot those to trigger the replicating rockets. Like with the Pyroshell Seeking Flares trait, the replicating rockets are capable of hitting the same target that they were generated from. Mega Rocket fires a more powerful but slower rocket instead of the normal salvo. Once you get to tier 3 traits, your Thermogenic Launcher will lose the 3 rocket salvo behavior in favor of this trait or the upcoming one. For Mega Rocket, instead of getting 3 small rockets, you get one big one that deals more damage. The explosion radius is also much larger. The damage increase is significant, but ultimately this is the worst of the 2 tier 3 traits due to how badly it synergizes with the other traits. If paired with replicating hits, the duplicate rocket will still do damage as if it came off a regular, weaker rocket. This is a huge nerf to the synergy of the trait. It doesn't scale great with one of the upcoming traits either, but I'll discuss that when I get to it. I can say that it actually properly scales with critical rockets, in that it will do 50% of the damage of your Mega Rocket. Nice I guess, but critical rockets was already an underwhelming trait. Full Auto. Fires at full auto mode. Rocket Launcher Machine Gun. Just like Mega Rocket, you lose the 3-shot salvo. This time, you can hold down the trigger to rapid fire rockets. The damage per rocket is the same as the base salvo version, but you're ultimately shooting much faster than you would be otherwise. Even a level 1 trait can empty a clip fairly quickly, with a level 3 trait increasing the fire rate immensely. If paired with replicating hits, you get the same duplicated rocket with the same damage that you would under Mega Rocket. This time, however, you'll be firing many more rockets into the enemy, resulting in a large quantity of replicating hits. I'm noticing that more so with any other weapon, I only really have one trait for each tier that I would prefer. So far, having a Thermogenic Launcher with critical rocket, replicating hits, and full auto really does seem like the best way to go. This does make the rocket a bit more boring in terms of build diversity. Luckily, I think the last 2 traits are both viable. Thermite Rockets. Projectiles cause additional damage over time. This functions very similarly to the Sidearm Serrated Projectiles trait, which is fitting as they kept the same description. Just like with the Sidearm, the damage appears to be a percentage of your rocket damage. In this case, the damage percentage actually increases with the trait level. At level 1, the damage per tick looked to be about 12.5% of a direct hit with a rocket. At level 3, this goes up to about 20%. It will last for 10 damage ticks regardless of the level, just like serrated projectiles. I'm not sure if the number of maximum stats is affected by level. The rockets do too much damage individually to reliably test this, as the enemy tends to already be dead by the time you go for additional stacks. Either way, the max number of stacks is at least more than 1, so firing multiple rockets is a way to increase the damage from this trait. If you hit an enemy with a rocket's explosion rather than with a direct hit, you'll still trigger the dot effect. The damage of the dot doesn't even seem to go down with the explosion versus a direct hit. Note that if you pair this with replicating hits, the duplicate rocket won't trigger this effect. Tailfire. Fires an additional, more powerful projectile at the end of each salvo. Sort of an ironic description, even if it is accurate. Since this is a tier 4 trait, you won't see it without already having full auto or Mega Rocket, meaning you won't see the extra shot come out with the 3 rocket salvo because you'll never have the 3 rocket salvo. You'll only ever see this interaction if you're unlocking a higher tier version of those 2 traits, in which case your rocket will go back to the 3-shot version until the trait is unlocked. Regardless, the description is accurate. You'll get an extra rocket following your shots. If paired with full auto, you get 1 extra rocket for every 3 you fire. If paired with Mega Rocket, you get 1 with every shot. Even though that sounds like it's synergizing with Mega Rocket pretty well, I would still prefer to have this paired with full auto. The damage of the tail-fired rocket isn't any higher regardless of which of the 2 is paired with, and full auto just fires them so much more quickly. The tailed-fired rocket also synergizes with replicating hits. If the tail fire hits an enemy or object, a new replicating rocket will come out. At max level, your rocket will do 1.75 times the damage of a regular rocket. Electropylon Driver, mechanical weapon, fires pylons that attach to surfaces and connect to each other, forming damaging tethers. It's starting to get harder to equate Returnal's guns to real-world examples. From here forward, they start showing some unique functions. The Electropylon Driver is the gun that's most geared towards damage over time. Once fully set up, there'll be no way to increase the damage you deal with the direct shots from the pylons. Instead, you'll have to look to deal extra damage with melee hits or alternate fires, that or look for new enemies to attack. As the description says, you plant a pylon onto a surface every time you fire. If the pylons are within range and have an unobstructed line of sight, they'll form a link with red lightning that will deal damage to anything caught in it. This weapon has the most nuance in how its damage works than any other weapon in the game. There are 3 ways that you can do damage: attaching a pylon directly, lightning fence damage, or lightning channeled onto an enemy with an attached pylon. Each of these categories will deal a steady stream of damage, with it consistently ticking down the enemy's health. Attaching a single pylon to an enemy will result in the lowest amount of damage that you can do. It'll take a fair bit for even the weakest enemies to die from this damage. If instead, you set up a fence by attaching pylons to walls and floors, any enemy in the middle of the lightning field will take 62% more damage than if they had a single pylon stuck to them. The way to do the most damage, and the one you'll be using most often, is to have at least one pylon attached to an enemy with lightning being channeled into it. Doing this results in about 166% more damage than if you only had one pylon attached to an enemy without the lightning being channeled. It doesn't matter if the second pylon in the fence is attached to the same enemy or on a different surface, the damage will still be the same. You'll be good if at least one of the pylons is attached to the enemy. Again, this is the most damage you'll be doing with the pylons, whether you have 2 pylons attached to them or 10. Once set up, it's smart to either hang back or seek out other enemies that you can tag. For stats, we have projectile speed and pylon duration. Projectile speed is the same as it was for the carbine. At max level, your shots will travel very fast. Pylon duration increases how long a stuck pylon will remain before it expires on its own. At 0 stats, your pylons last 10 seconds, which honestly is already pretty long. If you max out the pylon duration stat, they'll now last a full 25 seconds. There isn't much that will survive 25 seconds of full damage pylons until you get much higher in the tower, aside from Algus. You are only allowed 18 active pylons at once. Any more than that, and the pylons will start disappearing, starting with the oldest ones first. This should be more than enough to work with, so the limit shouldn't really pose any problems. Besides, without the right traits, and at lower level pylon durations, shots will disappear on their own faster than you can fire them off. Obolite Extractor. Hostiles have a higher chance to drop obolite chunks. This is referring to the small clusters of obolites that you need to pass through in order to pick up. I don't want to spend much time on this ability, it's another boring obolite based one. I'll just mention that it allows for destructible objects to house these chunks as well. Ignore the individual obolites you see on screen, those always have a chance of dropping, it's just the chunks that I'm talking about. Silphium Extractor. Hostiles have a higher chance to drop Silphium. Silphium is the healing item in this game. Still a pretty boring ability, it's not bad though. More health drops means more survivability. Like with Obolite Extractor, destructible objects can now also hold the Silphium. This is actually fantastic for rooms where your multiplier isn't ticking down. If you're not at full health, you might as well destroy the eggs and statues that you see in order for a chance to refill. I won't get into details since it's for another video, but if you have the artifact Resinous Shield, this also synergizes extremely well with that. Pylon Web. Fires all pylons simultaneously in a web-like pattern. All is a loose interpretation, as it neither fires a maximum of 18 pylons or fully empties your clip. The pylons come out in what appears to be a shotgun-like spread. Even though it looks random, the shots actually always fire in the same trajectory. Focusing your aim also has no impact on the spread, unlike the Spitmaw Blaster. Keep in mind that one of the pylons is still always going down the center of your sights, so you're not sacrificing accuracy with this trait, you're just adding pylons to the surroundings. I find the web to be pretty fun to use. It doesn't really help with hitting a single target, but it does make hitting surrounding enemies more likely. It also makes it so you're pretty much always doing max damage, as long as you hit them with at least one of the pylons. The nature of the web will make it so that surrounding pylons will pretty much always be channeling into each other. At higher levels, the pattern of the web will add more pylons every time you shoot. Finisher increases tether damage when hostiles are at low health. When using this at level 3, the amount of extra damage is actually doubled. It's still not all that effective since the extra damage only comes when the enemy is at about 20% remaining health. This means that in the best case, you'll only be killing enemies about 10% faster. Streamlined Chamber. Increased fire rate. This is the first time that I don't think increasing your fire rate is really all that useful. You only need 2 pylons to reach maximum damage, and that damage can last up to 25 seconds if your pylons are at maximum duration. It can help if you're having trouble hitting an enemy, since you'll be rapid firing them, but besides that I don't really find much use for this trait. The higher levels further increase the rate of fire, but again, this is pretty limited in use. Enlarged Chamber. Overheat limit increased. Are you enjoying this trait? Because it's still not the last time you'll see it. Normally, you get 6 shots per clip when using the driver, or 2 if you have the pylon web trait. Enlarged Chamber adds 3 shots per level, or just 1 if you have the web. So, at maximum trait level, it will result in a clip that's 2.5 times the size of the original. Blade Harmonizer increases melee damage while this weapon is equipped. If all you care about is killing enemies quickly, then this is a bad trait. Your melee will already one-shot small enemies and turrets, and large enemies will have increasingly larger health pools as you go up the tower. Since melee damage doesn't scale in the way other weapons do, you'll be doing almost no damage to the higher level enemies. At level 3, your blade damage will be doubled to a value of 120, remember that it used to be 60 at base. Melee damage is unique in that it doesn't scale with any other damage stat in the game. So, 120 at the trait level of 3 is pretty much all you'll be doing, unless you're striking a staggered enemy. You do still get the same triple damage scaling when hitting a staggered enemy, meaning that the first hit against one of them will now do 360 damage. If you're actually aiming for a high score, this trait can be helpful. Without getting into much detail, using melee will result in many more points than killing an enemy with weapon fire. If you're looking to maximize your points, it can be easier to weaken an enemy with weapon damage before closing in for a melee kill. It's pretty easy to finish off large enemies early on in the tower, but the higher health pools later make it so that even small slivers of health can take several swings to take them out. If you are running this trait, it will take longer before you start encountering this problem. Blade Pulse. Melee hits trigger a damaging pulse from the pylons. I can see where they were going with this gun. Since you reach max damage so quickly, you'll be highly incentivized to start using your blade in conjunction with the pylons. In this case, your pylons will shoot out additional lightning bolts towards enemies whenever you connect a melee hit. The melee hit doesn't need to be on an enemy with an attached pylon. Actually, you can just swing at destructible objects to trigger the effect if you really want to. I'm assuming higher levels do more damage or increase the range of the pulse, but I'm not 100% sure. The damage is certainly noticeable, and it gets bonus points for being so damn cool. Protective Pylons. Increase protection when near a pylon. If Celine could stick a pylon to herself, this would actually be a very good trait. Since you can't, I don't find this trait to be all that good. Being near a pylon will show you a circle that you can stand in for an increase to your protection stat. The increase is 10% per level of this trait, so at level 3 it becomes a 30% increase. That's actually rather huge, but the effect won't usually be active. Because you have to be near a pylon, you're not likely to stay inside of a zone of effect very often. When you do leave the zone, the extra protection disappears almost instantly. The radius is also so small that you don't really have all that much wiggle room. At least you'll get extra defense when you go in for a melee against an enemy with a pylon already stuck to them. Rotgland Lobber. Bioengineered weapon. Fires acidic fluid. Charge weapon to launch further. This is another single shot gun, like the Coilspine Shredder. Instead of firing a high damage round, you shoot out an acid orb that sticks to surfaces and enemies. The shots don't do any damage on impact. Instead, it applies a damage over time effect for direct hits, or to enemies that pass over any covered surfaces. Also unlike the Coilspine, charging it up doesn't increase the damage you deal. It will only increase how far the shot will travel. The damage over time is actually very high, even without any traits. A drawback is that the weapon won't do any extra damage to an enemy's weakness. This is the only gun that functions this way. When sticking enemies with the rot directly, the effect will last anywhere from 6 to 11 ticks of damage. I don't know why it behaves this way, and I wasn't able to get anything consistent even when using the same exact version of the gun. Its reload speed is the fastest in the game, which is nice since it only gets one shot per clip. Charge for the Rotgland are Charge Boost and Splash Radius. Charge Boost reduces the time it takes to build up a full charge. At level 0, it takes 1 second to reach full charge. If this stat is at 15, it will decrease the charge time to less than half a second. Splash Radius increases the size of the rot pools left behind on walls and floors. This isn't too useful, as most of the damage will come from direct hits. Durable Rot increases the duration of the rot. Normally, rot on the ground or on walls only lasts about 2.5 seconds. Every level of this trait will increase this by roughly another 2.5 seconds. At level 3, your rot will stay on surfaces for a full 10 seconds. If this is all it does, it's not terribly useful. Enemies will usually take damage from this gun after being hit directly. You can't really rely on the enemies to pass through the pools of rot, especially if they're flying. If this trait increases the duration of the direct hits, then I'd say it'd be highly worth it. I'm not really sure if it does that. Like I said, direct hits to enemies doesn't give you a consistent amount of time for the duration of the effect. This made testing the trait difficult, so I can't really conclude one way or the other. Trailing Rot projectiles leave a trail of rot on the ground. The rot is actually left as multiple pools in a line below the trajectory of your shot. It's a fun effect that allows you to hit enemies below your shots as the trail drops down below. Higher levels of this trait will increase the width of the trail. I still don't think that rot pools are all that useful, but this trait creates so many of them that enemies can more easily wander in. You can't pair it with durable rot though, so they'll disappear very quickly. Bouncing rot. Projectiles bounce before exploding. Same description as the Pyroshells bouncing projectiles. This time, your bounces won't produce any homing shots. Instead, any surface it touches while bouncing will now have a pool of rot. Bouncing rot does increase the chances of a direct hit, which is kinda nice. You'll get 1 bounce per level maximum, same as the Pyroshell. So at level 3, it can bounce up to 3 times. Enlarged Chamber. Overheat limit increased. That's right, the last 5 weapons in a row had this trait. It functions just like the others, being most similar to the Coilspine as it adds 1 extra shot per level. It's not as useful on this gun however, as you won't do any extra damage for reapplying the effect to the same enemy. Once the effect is applied, hitting them again will only reset the duration. This might have been more useful for multiple enemies, but the reload speed is so fast that you'll likely have overloaded your weapon by the time you turn your character to face them. Good for rapid firing if you're having trouble hitting a small distant target at least. Explosive Rot. Projectiles explode on impact. Ironic that this shares a tier with Enlarged Chamber. It would have been nice to be able to combine the two traits. This actually makes the impact of the shot do damage in addition to the dot effect applied. Now there's some incentive to focus down a single enemy. Higher levels of this trait doesn't increase the damage, at least not for a direct hit. This makes the explosion seem highly effective early on in the tower, only to have the damage drop off significantly the higher you climb. Also, enemies caught in the explosion but not in the rot won't have the dot effect applied to them. You probably also won't want this paired with Bouncing Rot, as hitting near an enemy will now cause the shot to keep going before it explodes. A similar problem that you would have with a Pyroshell. Even with all that, the explosion damage is a nice addition, and probably preferable to Enlarged Chamber in most cases. Also, the explosion does do extra damage to enemy weak points, which I only point out because the basic shots don't. Protective Rot. Standing in the rot provides extra protection. This scales just like it does for the Electropylon's Protective Pylons trait. You'll get 10% extra protection per level with a max of 30% at trait level 3. On the Rotgland, however, I find this has the potential to be more useful. Unlike the Pylons version, the rot actually lasts for a little while after you leave the pools. This might not seem significant, but it means if you're running between pools that are close together, you won't ever lose the protection. This might not sound that useful on its own, but when paired with Trailing Rot, you're much more likely to be affected by it. This is because Trailing Rot starts leaving pools right in front of you. It's still not perfect, but if you're moving forwards anyway, you're likely to have a 30% increase to your protection, which is massive. Caustic Rot. Direct hits deal additional damage over time. As the description says, it has to be a direct hit. You won't get any extra damage from enemies caught in the raw pools. I'm assuming higher levels increase the amount of extra damage. I had a lot of trouble reliably testing this. Regardless, any extra damage is good, so I'm happy to receive this trait when it shows up. Tendril Rot. Tendrils reach out from rot puddles dealing damage to hostiles. This can be a very effective ability, especially against grounded enemies. The extra damage it does is nice, but the description isn't mentioning the secondary effect. Enemies being hit by the tendrils also receive a massive nerf to their speed. This isn't just movement speed either. All their animations, including attack animations, are slowed down. Since rot pools appear on the ground directly below where you hit an enemy, direct hits to grounded enemies are likely to have them caught in the tendrils. This also means that it's hard to get it to work against flyers, unless the enemy is hugging walls or surfaces. Still, I think this is a fantastic ability. Portal Rot. Hostiles killed by the rot create a projectile firing portal. The portal it creates will rapid fire against enemies a fair distance away. Unlike Tendril Rot, this is easy to use against flyers as the portals have good aim. Not to mention, enemies killed in the air will also spawn their own portals that will just float there. In order to spawn the portal, the enemy must be killed by the damage over time effect. If you have the Explosive Rot ability, you can't kill them with a blast from a direct hit. If you do, no portal will show up. This also means that you won't get extra portals for enemies killed by portals. For some reason, just like the dot effect, the duration of the portal isn't consistent. I'm not sure if high levels impact the duration because of this. It might just be impacting the damage. Hollowseeker. Unknown weapon, extremely high rate of fire. This sends out tons of small bullets with extremely long range. Shots will first spread outwards from your gun, before angling inwards towards where you aimed. This extra movement can make it extremely hard to hit moving targets. If you're not using aim assist, you'll have to try aiming your shots if the enemy's moving. If you are using aim assist, you're likely to just miss unless the enemy's at a complete standstill. For stats, we have projectile reactivity and stability. I know what one of these does, but I'm not even sure which of the two does it. As you get higher level Hollowseekers, your shots will start angling inwards sooner. Eventually, they go pretty much in a straight line as soon as you fire them. Undeniably, this is good as it will make you much more accurate. It's the only difference I noticed when using the gun. I'm not sure if it's projectile reactivity or stability causing this to happen. It's possible that the other stat lowers recoil or shot spread, but it's hard to tell as neither of those were too bad to begin with. As the game never gives you a description for any of the stats, I can only guess what's actually happening. Phasing rounds. Projectiles can pass through surfaces. An awesome trait in my opinion. Regardless of the level, all your shots will pass through surfaces, albeit with a nerf to its damage. When using a level 1 trait, any shot that passes through surfaces will do about 1/4 to 1/3 the damage of the original. A level 2 trait increases this to about 1/2 to 2/3 the damage of the original, while a level 3 trait eliminates the damage nerf entirely. There are later traits that make the Hollowseeker excel even more when you're hiding behind cover, so just being able to straight up shoot enemies when you're hiding behind a pillar or a wall will make it even more effective. Waves. Fires damaging waves in addition to the projectiles. This will add a wide, more powerful projectile that comes out slower than the regular shots. Higher levels of this trait will significantly increase how often the wave comes out. This might seem like a good trait, especially if you get it early on, but unfortunately, it's pretty bad. While you are getting a higher rate of fire, you aren't getting any extra damage. I know this isn't the only trait that does this, but this trait is unique in that you never increase the damage. No matter how high the weapon or Celine's damage stats are, you keep doing 16 damage per wave. This becomes pitiful at higher levels of the tower. I'm guessing this lack of scaling isn't intentional, but it makes me never want to have the ability. For context, I tested a level 1 version of this trait with a Hollowseeker that had 0 damage stat. Each wave was doing 16 damage then. When testing a different Hollowseeker that had 15 damage stat and wave trait level 2, it was still only 16 damage per wave. Celine even had damage buffs to her character directly, and it was still the same. At least it doesn't make the gun worse, aside from the traits you're giving up. I guess the last little bonus is that the waves actually pass through walls, but the damage is just too low to really matter. Retarget. Projectiles seek out additional hostiles upon hitting the initial target. This works very similarly to the Sidearm's piercing ability. Just like then, I seem to have better odds of hitting another enemy with higher levels of this trait. Still hard to test, just like other similar traits on different weapons, so I'm going to assume that's what it does at higher levels. It's a useful trait regardless, that will help you damage multiple enemies at once. Serrated projectiles. Projectiles cause additional damage over time. From what I can tell, this functions almost exactly like it does with the Sidearm. The dot effect is a percentage of the damage of your shots. Just like with the Sidearm, increasing the level won't increase the damage of the dot. Instead, it looks to increase how many times you can stack the effect. At level 1, you can have 4 stacks going on the same enemy at once. At max level, the damage ticks can happen so frequently that I'm not really sure how many stacks I have applied. But I think it's safe to say that it's more than 4. Damage per tick is always 1/3 that of the original shot, and the effect will last 10 ticks. Since it scales with the damage of your shot, remember that pairing this with a lower level phasing rounds trait will also decrease the damage per tick when shooting through surfaces. Shrapnel. Projectiles may explode into multiple shards on impact. The Hollowseeker and Sidearm really borrowed a lot of inspiration from each other. Just like with the Sidearm, I don't find this ability very good. You can sometimes get enemies caught in the shards if they're grouped up, but it's not good for much else. It's probably always best to have serrated projectiles instead. I'm not even sure what high levels of this trait does, maybe more shards. Split Stream. Fires an additional stream of homing shards. The homing effect is only triggered if your aim is fairly close, but it's better than nothing. The damage itself is noticeably lower than that of your base fire, but extra damage is extra damage, so it's hard to complain. As I said with phasing rounds, this hurts your synergy with serrated projectiles, as these rounds can also trigger the serrated projectile effect. Since you can only have so many of the dot effects going at once, you'll have some of those being eaten up by the split stream. This doesn't make this ability bad, but it is something to keep in mind. Portal Beam. Creates a beam firing portal that targets nearby hostiles. Forget what I said, you don't want split stream. This ability outclasses it pretty heavily. The portal will set up after you shoot a set number of bullets. This doesn't change with higher levels. What does change is how long the portal lasts. A level 3 portal lasts about 10 seconds. This isn't enough time to get a second portal out for a few moments before the first disappears, provided you never stop shooting. The damage and accuracy of the portal is high enough so that it can focus on enemies on its own, without needing your help. This, along with phasing rounds and serrated projectiles, is what makes the Hollowseeker so good at hiding behind cover. You're able to do so much damage without ever exposing Celine to harm. Oscillator. Projectiles are fired in an oscillating pattern and deal increased damage. I don't know what they were thinking with this trait. The oscillation is so pronounced that it's almost impossible to consistently hit anything with it. I more often than not see my shots miss and just weave around enemies. However much it's increasing your damage, it isn't enough. When using it in practice, my damage output is always much lower than if I never had the trait. Even against Algus, I'm not doing all that much damage despite hitting them with all the shots. Portal Turret. Creates a projectile firing portal at targets nearby hostiles. The best quality of Portal Turret is that it is an oscillator. This is another Hollowseeker trait that, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to scale with damage stats. At higher levels, the turret will stay out longer, just like with Portal Beam. Unlike Portal Beam, the little guy has trouble hitting enemies at all. The projectiles are slow enough that anything moving is likely to dodge the shots. When it does hit, it does 2 whole damage per bullet. If there is damage being added through stats, then the base version must have been so weak that it wasn't even noticeable. It doesn't actively make your weapon worse, so I would rather have it over the alternative Oscillator. Just don't expect much from the trait. Dreadbound. Unknown weapon. Fires projectiles that return to it. I would call this the most unique weapon in Returnal. The Dreadbound gets 3 shots per clip, which return to you after traveling a set distance or hitting something. You'll never need to reload the weapon, since your ammo is always determined by whether or not the shots have returned to you. Because of this, you're more likely to want to remain at close or medium distance from enemies. If you're too far, you'll have gaps when you're not able to shoot at all. The damage per shot is pretty high, meaning that if you can maximize your rate of fire, enemies should fall quickly. Unfortunately, missing with the Dreadbound is very punishing. If you do miss, especially against aerial foes, you'll have to wait a long time before your shot returns to you and you can start firing again. Because of this, the Dreadbound's usefulness scales heavily with its stats, projectile speed and projectile return speed. The stats do just what they say. The higher they are, the faster your shots will travel and return respectively. This also means that with higher stats, you can shoot more often from farther away. It also means that missing isn't as punishing due to how much faster you get the shots again. At stats level 0, it takes about 5 seconds for a shot to return to you after you fire. If both these stats are maxed out, it only takes about 2 seconds if you miss. Fourth Shard has an additional projectile which grows more powerful at higher levels. Just having a 4th bullet is immensely useful. It allows you to be further back without sacrificing rate of fire. The fact that the 4th shard is stronger is an added bonus. The question is, which shard is the 4th one? If you guessed the 4th one, then you would be wrong. It's actually the 1st in the clip. This means that you have to fire your gun while all 4 shards are available to you to get the extra damage. If you're too far back and never release the firing trigger, you'll never go back into full ammo. This means you'll never get the extra damage from the 4th shard. From testing, it looks like only levels 2 and 3 actually provide any extra damage. At the first level, the 4th shard seems to be the same as the other 3. Aside from extra damage and a larger clip size, the 4th shard synergizes extremely well with other traits, which I'll cover later. Obolite Magnet increases obolite collection radius. Clearly, these types of traits aren't for me. I don't know by how much it's increasing your collection radius, and I wasn't very motivated to test. As I've stated before, obolites aren't a limiting resource in my runs, so being able to get more doesn't really help. Staggering. Increased stagger power. Another trait I wasn't too keen on testing. Stagger damage isn't something the game shows you, at least not numerically. It's not usually very hard to stagger enemies anyway, especially with how melee is always available to you. In all honesty, it's best to just hope for 4th shard as your tier 1 trait. Protection Steel. Successful hits provide bonus protection on return. So long as you hit an enemy, your defense will go on upon the shard's return. The amount of defense you get increases with each level of the trait. You'll get an extra 3, 5, or 7% defense increase per shard per level. This stacks with 4th shard, meaning you can get an extra 28% defense if all 4 shards have hit an enemy recently. I find this to be the best defensive trait in the game. It's much more likely to be active than if you were using the Rotgland or the Electropylon's version, and the defense increase is almost as high as long as you have 4th shard. It's not guaranteed, like with the Carbine, but has the potential to be significantly higher. The defense increase lasts long enough that consistently refreshing it shouldn't be a problem. Firing off your shots while the defense boost is active won't get rid of the effect either. Only the effect running out naturally would make the protection go back down. Expanding Shards. Projectile size and damage increases the further they travel. At medium and long ranges, this will significantly increase the damage dealt per shot. You don't have to hang back across the entire map either, since the shard will stop expanding after a short time. The expanding shard also has a much larger hitbox, making it easier to hit targets. Returning damage. Projectiles deal damage when returning as well. Once hitting something, the projectiles will now deal damage to any enemies caught on its return path. You can see this, as shards will now turn red once they start returning. If it was just useful for hitting enemies caught in the path, I'd say this ability is pretty bad. Luckily, it also does the extra damage to the enemy you hit. Explosive shards. Projectiles explode upon impact. This can be against an enemy or a surface, although the blast radius is actually quite small, even at max level. It will catch other enemies in the blast if they're close together. But more than that, it will increase the damage of your shots due to the added explosion. At least, that's what I think it's meant to do. Just like when combining Burst Fire with Charging Shot on the sidearm, this trait causes your shot damage to heavily drop off when you keep firing against the same enemy. The footage on screen is for a level 3 Explosive Shards trait, so I can't confirm if this is consistent with the lower trait levels. If you're looking closely, you can see that the first bullet does extremely high damage, with the following bullets doing much less. If this is unintentional, it's a shame that the damage drops off so quickly. Damage Steal. Successful hits provide bonus damage upon return. This functions the same as with Protection Steal, but with damage instead. What is different is that the game won't reflect the damage increase in Celine's stats. This made testing somewhat annoying, and I wasn't able to get exact increases. At level 3, my damage seemed to go up by 5% per shard. You don't have to hit the enemy with the shard that has the boosted damage either. The damage of all bullets increases, regardless of which one has the damage steal active. If you have 4th shard, and all 4 shards have it active, that would be a 20% damage increase. This is nice, but not nearly as significant as other DPS increasing traits on other weapons. Obolite Generator. Successful hits generate obolites. This makes obolites spill out at enemies that you shoot. It's admittingly kind of fun to just see the money pour out, but as I said previously, I don't really care about obolites. At least, not any more than the game gives you naturally. You do get points for dropped obolites, which makes me wonder if you could infinitely farm points on one of the healing tower rooms. Perhaps I'll test this later. That was the last trait of the basic weapons. Not a terribly exciting note to end on, but oh well. I'll still have a good amount to say about the alternate fires, so let's move on. Okay, there is one interaction between Dreadbound traits that I purposely skipped discussing. I was fairly sure about some things not working as Housemarque intended, but for this combination, I'm sure that they didn't want it to work this way. For some reason, combining explosive shards with expanding shards causes the blast radius of your shots to become exponentially larger. I don't even have words to quantify how large the blast radius is. Just look at the images playing on screen. Enemies far removed from where I'm shooting are just randomly dying. The visual for the explosion doesn't come close to matching how far it actually reaches. Seriously, the explosion range dwarfs all other blast radiuses. The damage itself is very high, even if you don't directly hit a target. You can rely on the blast radius to just shred opponents until you get fairly high in the tower. The ridiculous blast radius was enough to already convince me that this isn't intentional, but there's more evidence to support this. When using this gun and trait combination, your little homing adrenaline shots will randomly not be so little anymore. They don't seem to do any more damage, they're just inexplicably huge at times. There's also a tendency for the shards to explode on objects that are nowhere near it at times. This is clearest when you're fighting Algos, with my shots exploding well before they hit anything. Also, if you have the permanent malfunction that causes enemies to counter on hit, the counter shots will appear from wherever the explosion occurred, rather than from the enemy. The blast is so huge that the counter shots appear nowhere near from where the enemy was hit. I know I'm not the first to have discovered this interaction, and others seem to enjoy using the Dreadbound specifically because of it. I admit that it's funny just how overtuned this synergy is, but if Housemarque wanted to change how this works, I wouldn't hold it against them. Okay, that really was the end of the Dreadbound section. But before I move on to alternate fires, I want to address the bonus damage stat that I've been avoiding discussing on all the weapons. Originally, I was hoping to discuss how much extra damage you would do with a maxed out damage stat versus a damage stat of 0. Unfortunately, testing this started to become highly impractical. Most weapons have damage modifications or behavior changes that are likely to occur at higher proficiency levels. For example, the Sidearm's serrated projectiles trait, the Thermogenic Launcher's Mega Rocket or Thermite Rocket traits, and the Spitmaw's Explosive Spit and Piercing Spit traits. Some of these effects completely change a weapon's damage properties or apply the damage at the same time as the base shot itself. It's fairly straightforward to test weapon damage at proficiency level 0. Picking up a random weapon from the second room without first picking up the 2 calibrators almost guarantees a weapon stat of 0. I only need to keep resetting and getting to the second room until I find a gun I want to test. The issue comes when trying to compare to a maxed out weapon. You're unlikely to come across a weapon with a maxed out damage stat without being very close to max level yourself. This means that you'll probably have 4 traits with varying effects attached to the weapon, and these traits can range from levels 1 to 3. It's because this is so inconsistent that I don't feel comfortable with all the testing I did for max leveled weapons. The only weapons I got clean comparisons for were the Carbine, the Coilspine Shredder, and the Electropylon Driver. The Carbine and Coilspine both do double damage when comparing a maxed out damage stat weapon to its base level 0 version. This is without applying any other traits, like high caliber or enhanced charge. This is also without applying Selene's damage stat. I haven't mentioned it much, but Selene has her own weapon damage stat that's separate from your weapon's damage stat. It would be easy to confuse the two if I'm discussing them, so I wanted to avoid bringing up the damage stats at all. Note that when I say a weapon does double damage from 0 to 15, I'm talking about the weapon's damage stat, not Selene's damage. Having Selene's damage increase also stacks with this, but hers is much more straightforward and just tells you how much is increasing it by. Anyway, the Electropylon Driver does 3 times the damage when comparing a max level 1 to a level 0. The fact that the Electropylon gets a different multiplier than the other 2 weapons means that I can't assume how the others will behave. On the topic of damage, the upcoming alternate fires I'm about to discuss don't always scale with a weapon's bonus damage stat. Again, I'm not talking about Selene's damage stat. All the alternate fires scale with that, just not the weapons. When I get to an alternate fire that doesn't scale with a weapon's bonus damage stat, I'll mention it. Otherwise, just assume that it does scale properly. I've already pretty much changed topics to alternate fires now, so let's just move on. Alternate fire's various types and powers can help supplement your weapon's strengths or weaknesses. No gun gets its own unique alt fire. Instead, any of the 10 guns can have one of the 11 alt fires in the game. These are assigned at random, and with a random level from 1 to 3. Much like weapon traits, the cutoffs for being able to get a higher level alternate fire is the same. This means that you won't find any level 3 alternate fires until your weapon is at least level 20. Shield Breaker. A single shot blast that destroys shields and deals damage. The Shield Breaker is useful as both a powerful snipe and to destroy shields of targets. It travels far and quickly, so it's good for destroying shields of hard to reach enemies. The shot comes out much like the Coilspines in that it's both fast and accurate. You shouldn't feel compelled to use this only on shielded enemies. The shot's damage is high enough so that you can use it on anything. And this damage increases with higher levels of this alt fire. Regardless of level, it will always take 20 seconds to cool down. Killsight. A single shot that zooms in to deal extra damage. This has a practically identical trajectory to the Shield Breaker. Key differences are that it pierces targets, bounces off surfaces, and doesn't break an enemy's shield. This alt also increases the amount that you zoom in when you're aiming to fire it, a feature which can be a bit annoying if you're aiming for an enemy that isn't too far away. Like Shield Breaker, Killsight has a 20-second cooldown. Out of the 11 alt fires, I spent the most time testing this one, only to conclude that I still don't know how the damage works. With only a few exceptions, damage to enemies is consistent no matter which enemy you're hitting, so long as you're not hitting the weak point. The only thing that matters is what you're hitting them with. Shooting one enemy with a sidearm will produce the same amount of damage as shooting another enemy later in the tower, again, provided you aren't hitting a weak point. For some reason, the Killsight doesn't follow these rules at all. Damage when you're not hitting a weak point will now vary between enemies. While shooting the same enemy over and over will result in the same amount of damage, switching to a different enemy will change this. It is sometimes the same between enemies, but the amount of variation is much more inconsistent than any other weapon in the game. What's more, while Killsight's damage does increase with damage stats, it's affected by Selene's damage stat at a different rate than any other weapon. Selene's damage stat is blessedly transparent, in that you can see the exact amount that it's increasing your damage. In all my testing, it's been completely accurate, so if it says 10%, you'll do 10% more. Unless you're using the Killsight. A 10% damage increase when using a Killsight only does about 3% more. I don't really understand how this can be inconsistent. Admittingly, the Killsight is meant for hitting enemy weak points, so it shouldn't really matter as long as hitting weak points is consistent. But it's inconsistent here as well. Any enemy that has a weak point has a multiplier applied to the damage dealt to it. This multiplier isn't universal, different enemies have a different multiplier. For example, the Echoing Turret takes 2.6 times more damage when hitting its weak point. When you shoot a Crimson Turret's weak point, you'll instead do 1.5 times the damage. The damage increase is consistent across weapons, it's only the enemy type that you hit that determines the multiplier. The Killsight is the exception to this rule, once again. Going back to the Crimson Turret example, hitting its weak point with a level 1 Killsight increased the damage by only 26%. You would think that the Killsight's multiplier should be higher, but this isn't always the case. After several hours of shooting enemies with various levels of Killsight, I concluded the following. The damage of the Killsight scales up differently than any other attack. This is true for both your weapon damage stat and Celine's damage stat. The damage does scale with the level of the Killsight, meaning a level 3 will always do more than the lower level versions. The extra damage you do get from hitting an enemy weak points functions on a separate multiplier than if you hit the weak point with any other attack. Finally, the extra damage you do to weak points is not only dependent on the enemy, but also on which level of Killsight you're using. That last point is important. There are definitely some enemies that have a higher weak point multiplier when hitting them with a high level Killsight than with any other weapon. Despite me not really understanding what the alt-fire's deal is, it does function as advertised, and that is great for sniping enemies from a distance. So despite all this, feel free to use it against elite enemies' weak points if you want to see them drop quickly. Blastshell, an explosive that detonates on impact. On impact actually means on enemy impact. If it hits a surface, it'll bounce once before exploding on a second surface. Blastshell will shoot out a single powerful grenade, which increases in damage and blast radius at higher levels. This is one of the alt-fires I mentioned earlier, which won't scale with the weapon's damage stat. The only way to increase this damage is to have a level 2 or 3 version of the alt-fire, or to increase Celine's damage stat. This unfortunately means that the damage drops off pretty hard at higher tower levels. It does mean that testing the damage was really easy. A level 1 version of this attack will do 175 damage, level 2 will deal 263 damage, and level 3 will do 350 damage. Level 3 will also release smaller bombs on explosion, which deal 50 damage each. To help make up for the bad damage scaling, the Blastshell has the added property of breaking shields. Despite the description not telling you this, enemies caught in the blast will lose their shields. You won't do any damage on top of this, like if you broke their shields with Shield Breaker or with your melee, but it's still a useful way to deal with shields from a long range. What's more, the grenades won't bounce off shields, so you're safe to just launch it at a shielded opponent. Like the previous alts, it takes 20 seconds for this attack to recharge. Proximity Mine, an explosive that detonates when hostiles get close to it. You don't really ever want to use this in its capacity as a mine, as the explosion will almost never trigger unless enemies are directly on top of it. The mines will explode on contact when launched, so it's best to use it as a short-range grenade launcher instead. Unfortunately, it also shares the Blastshell's damage scaling problems. It'll scale with Celine's damage, but it won't scale with the weapon's bonus damage stat. This is the last alt-fire that behaves like this, so all the upcoming ones scale normally. At level 1, your mine will do 150 damage, 200 at level 2, or 250 at level 3. Increasing your alt-fire's level also increases how many mines you get with a full meter. You can shoot one per level, so at level 3, you'll have 3 mines. Rapid firing your level 3 proximity mines can be a quick way to deal with tankier enemies. The cooldown of the mine is dependent on the level of the alt. It takes just under 7 seconds for a level 1 alt to recharge, just under 13 for a level 2, and about 19.5 seconds for a level 3 version. Since you get additional usage per level, you actually have a slightly faster recharge rate per mine at the highest alt-fire level, and you're free to use the alt-fire if you have at least one charge ready. Each level also increases how many mines you can have active on the screen at once. Because the cooldown per mine is faster than the mine's duration, you're able to fire another mine while your first is still out. If this happens, the oldest one will just explode right away. The number you can have out at a time is equal to the alt-fire's level, so at level 3, you can have 3 mines out. If you do let the mines sit out without ever exploding, they'll last 15 seconds before detonating on their own. I want to avoid talking too much about artifacts in this video, but there is a pretty fun interaction between the Adrenaline Coolant artifact and a level 1 mine. The Adrenaline Coolant artifact can reduce your alt-fire by up to 5 seconds. Because the level 1 mine has the shortest cooldown in the game, you can actually have a cooldown of less than 2 seconds when pairing it with the Adrenaline Coolant artifact. I would still prefer to have a level 3 version of this alt-fire, but I wanted to mention it since it was a cool interaction. Like the Blastshell, the mine has a hidden ability to break shields. It works exactly the same. Enemies in the blast will lose their shield, but won't take any additional damage until you attack them again. Tendrilpod, an attachable pod that bursts into damaging tendrils. These will turn into the mentioned tendrils as soon as it makes contact with any surface or enemy. It will then deal damage to anything nearby until the tentacle disappears 10 seconds later. If attached directly to an enemy, the damage dealt to them is significantly higher. This is one of a couple alt-fires that won't deal any extra damage to an enemy weak point. Higher levels of the Tendril function just like the mine in that it increases both the damage and the number of charges you get. At level 1, you get 2 Tendrils for a full alt-fire meter. You'll get 1 additional Tendril for each level above that. So at level 3, you can fire 4 Tendrils at once. The damage will stack, so it's okay to stick multiple Tendrils to the same enemy. The cooldown for this is 13 seconds per Tendril. So at level 1, it takes 26 seconds for you to recharge to full. By level 3, it will take 52 seconds for all 4 Tendrils to be ready to use again. Like the mine, you're able to use this mid-charge, as long as the charge is high enough to fire at least once. Also, just like Tendril Rot on the Rotgland, enemies hit by this attack will slow down. Horizontal Barrage, a volley of projectiles fired in a horizontal pattern. The shots cover a very wide area and will fall to the ground over time. If they make contact with a surface or enemy, they'll bounce off and continue traveling. The attack does insanely high damage. The wide pattern makes it unlikely that you'll ever hit an enemy with all the shots, but you don't need to worry about this, as even a handful of bullets will still deal devastating damage. Higher levels increase the number of bullets, and presumably, the damage per shot too. It's hard to test damage when I can't reliably hit an enemy with all the shots, and they tend to die without all the shots ever making contact anyway. Like many other alt-fires, this takes 20 seconds to recharge. Vertical Barrage, a volley of projectiles fired in a vertical pattern. Sounds similar to Horizontal Barrage, but I say this one is harder to use well. The shots will be lined up on top of each other and travel in a straight line until they hit something. The shots travel so slowly that you either need to wait for the enemy to stop moving or lead them heavily. You don't need to worry about gravity like you would for the Horizontal Barrage, so hitting enemies in the air doesn't need you to compensate for the drop-off. Higher levels add additional barrages behind the first, up to a max of 3. Like with Horizontal Barrage, it's hard to compare damage. It will deal a decent amount provided you can hit with most of the shots. Just don't expect it to do as much as Horizontal Barrage. This is another alt-fire with a 20-second cooldown. Voidbeam, a long continuous beam that deals increasing damage if kept on a single target. Sounds like it will deal more damage if it's held on a single enemy, but in testing, the damage doesn't ever appear to change. Still, the DPS from channeling this is very high, and it travels instantly in a straight line. If you're using it against smaller enemies, you can easily take out a handful of them before the charge runs out. Aside from more damage, higher levels influence the duration and recharge of the move as well. At level 1, you can hold down the fire button for 4 seconds before it needs to be recharged. Depending on how sparingly you use it, it can last up to 13 seconds. Once used up, it will take 36 seconds to recharge back to full. Note that this isn't like Tendrilpod or the mine, where you can use the charges as long as you have enough for one attack. Once the alt-fire enters cooldown, you can't use it again until it's back up to full. Level 2 can be held down for almost 7 seconds, increasing up to 19 seconds depending on how little you use it once it's activated. Once depleted, you need to wait 54 seconds for a full recharge. Strangely, level 3 has the same duration and cooldown as level 2. It will just increase damage without any other change. The 54-second cooldown on level 2 and 3 versions of this alt-fire is the longest in the game. Because of this, if you aren't actively hitting an enemy, it's a good idea to release the trigger and orient yourself before firing again. It will still drain, but much slower, and you'll get much better usage. Like Tendrilpod, you won't deal any extra damage for hitting a weak point, at least not per any of my testing. Shockstream, a short-ranged, continuous stream of electricity. This is another channeled alt-fire, just like Voidbeam. The damage comes out in a somewhat narrow cone in front of you. You don't have to be looking directly at them, but you want to be at least pretty close in your aim. The range isn't too short. You can definitely hit medium-range targets without having to close the distance. The higher levels function similarly to how it works with Voidbeam. You'll get an increase in damage, but also an increase to how long it can be channeled. Level 1 will last between 4 and 10 seconds, depending on how long the trigger is held. Level 2 and 3 both have the same length, of 7 to 20 seconds. Just like Voidbeam, once the charge is used up, you need to wait for it to fully recharge before you can start using it again. The cooldown is always 20 seconds, regardless of level. Trackerswarm, a volley of insectoids that home in on the target hostile. They sure don't look like insects when you fire it, but who am I to question this game's highly accurate descriptions? This is the easiest ability to use, as the homing is very generous. It will travel a long range to hit a target, and deals fairly high damage. Honestly, I tend to do more damage with this attack than with Verticle Barrage. I don't have to take the time to line up the shot, and I can almost guarantee that all the shots will hit a target. While I suspect this does less than Verticle Barrage overall, it's much more consistent. Higher levels add more shots when you fire, and possibly more damage per shot. For reasons I've stated with Vertical and Horizontal Barrage, it's hard to test. This is another of the 20-second cooldown alt fires. Overall very easy to use, and it's another one and done alt fire, so I can't complain. Doombringer, a large energy ball that damages anything in its path and detonates on impact. When fired, the ball will move slowly and release lightning to attack anything around it as it moves through the air. The detonation occurs when it either hits a target or has flown for roughly 5 seconds. The ball will bounce off surfaces, but if it has 2 consecutive bounces too close to each other, it will detonate instantly. Charging the Doombringer is important, as at minimum charge, it will do significantly less damage. The surrounding lightning will also have much less range, in addition to the damage decrease. This is yet another alt that can break shields. If caught in the explosion, enemies will lose their shield but not take any extra damage. If hit directly with the ball, the shield will break, and the enemy behind it will, for some reason, take a lot of damage. It seems like higher levels only increase damage. The alt fire has a 40-second recharge, regardless of level. That was the final item I wanted to cover. Even with the amount of testing and rechecking that I did, there's still plenty of areas that I have gaps in my knowledge. If anyone does know more specifics or weapon properties that I missed, please feel free to let me know. I was consistently making new discoveries well beyond what I imagined I would find when I first started making this video. I hope that what I shared ends up being helpful for anyone that ends up seeing this video. A final note, I'm aware that I never covered the Discordia items. Those are sort of a hybrid between weapons and consumables, and due to this video's length, I decided to cover those when I cover items down the road. I'm assuming I'll need at least 2 more videos to adequately explain the tower and all the mechanics, but that could change depending on how much I end up having to say. For now, thanks for watching. Hope you look forward to the next one.